The American culture, the kind of roll up your sleeves and let's get it done culture, is one that still exists, and that people have been bottled up by this, I think, flawed operating system that doesn't let people use their judgment. There's opportunities for young people to come into government and reimagine how to use these tools in a way to really deliver and make the country better. There's so many areas of waste and inefficiency, healthcare, schools, et cetera. Well, all these things can get reinvented now.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores how government can be reimagined and reinvented to meet the demands of the 21st century through innovation, technology, and a renewed focus on outcomes for the American people. Our guests today are two nationally recognized thought leaders in public sector innovation and reform. Dan Chenok is the executive director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government and a former OMB official with expertise in federal IT, performance, and management. Philip Howard is the founder of Common Good and a leading voice on regulatory reform and governance modernization, known for his work on simplifying government and restoring common sense to public decision-making. Welcome to you both.
Thanks a lot, James Christian.
Let's begin with a broad view. What does it mean to reinvent government in today's context? How has the idea evolved since the 1990s? And what does it look like in particular in an era of digital transformation and AI? Dan, we can start with you.
I think it's important to think about this in kind of different phases leading up to today. If you think back to the 1990s, James Christian, as you mentioned, and the National Partnership for Reinventing Government, first known as National Performance Review, really kind of set in motion a lot of different reform initiatives, many good ideas, not a lot of staying power because they were sort of operated as they were in the White House and not overseen by the vice president, but they didn't link as much with some of the sustaining processes of government. So somebody else had to pick up their idea and then kind of bring it into their agency or adopt it. When George W. Bush came into office, and I was still at OMB at the time, and we created the first president's management agenda, we sort of took the opposite role and we said, what are a few key priorities for management reform? How do we make sure we can measure agency progress against those? And then how do we integrate them with agency deputy secretaries and chief information officers and others? So we created sort of a smaller in number, but larger in impact, I think, in terms of sustainability. A number of initiatives were started in NPR, picked up and sustained in the Bush administration, and are still around today. And one in Phil's area in particular is regulations.gov, which was started as a Department of Transportation initiative in the 1990s and then made a part of the president's management agenda. If you think about in sort of the data space, the Open Government Initiative of the Obama administration is probably, was a reform-focused initiative. There have been others like that. And so the question is, what can one learn from history in a time when you've got an administration that is basically willing to reform and reinvent in many different ways that other administrations have not? And then going forward, I think more importantly is how does this affect future sustainability of these kinds of efforts so that you get reform moving in a direction that has a positive impact for the American people and is sustainable and you can track progress effectively.
You can certainly experiment with new ideas and approaches, and you can obviously learn from historical insight. Philip, what do you think about reinventing government and how we can reimagine it in the same context?
Dan is much more knowledgeable than I am about all the reforms that have been tried in the last 30 years or so, although I've been involved in some of them, starting with reinventing government. My impression is that most of those reforms, including reinventing government, were limited by a perception of what was politically possible. And so they tended to be reforms to improve on the structure that was in place. And the structure that was in place is based, in my view, essentially on a compliance model and a model of civil service where there was much less flexibility to move people around, to terminate poor performers and that sort of thing. And I think that what the Trump administration has done is helpful, although maybe not intended to be helpful in this way, but is helpful in two ways. First of all, Trump has clearly disrupted the system. So that the old assumptions are off the table. I'd written a lot about executive power. The Trump people have picked up on it exponentially and done lots of things that I wouldn't have done. But they are, much more muscular assertion of executive power. And so there is disruption, but there's no vision that I can see of how things can work better. And so the second thing they've given us is they've created a vacuum and an opportunity. And so I think that we're at a truly unusual time in our lifetime, which is that there's an opening for a new model about how to administer government differently.
Dan, what are some of the elements? What are some of the values? And what might be some of the structural pieces that need to be in place for optimal government going forward?
I think, first of all, you want to make this about service to the people, meaning individuals, small businesses, state and local governments who are acting as a federal government steward in many ways, but a partner in other ways. So how do they interact with public funds in terms of the taxes that they pay? And what performance can they expect to see that kind of sits where they lived? There's been a lot of work over multiple administrations, including Obama, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and even recently with the Trump appointment of a chief design officer in the government, for kind of thinking about how do you present government in a way that people can find useful. I think Phil's raised an excellent point about, if you think about structural government reform, how do you think about it in the way that the government actually operates in the field? And if you're a small business dealing with 7 different agencies, there's a lot of different federal bureaucracy that you have to go through. So if you think about a vision for the future, it's certainly aspirational. How would you, even if you don't reorganize agencies per se, how do you organize programs in such a way that there's an integrated governance from a citizen-facing perspective? Because, reorganizing agencies requires legal change and it's very hard, but you could set up interagency governance structures that involve the people who are being served to create sort of a user-centered government delivery system. And that could be something done in, Napa hosts the Agile Government Center, which is a partnership with our center at IBM. That could be done by using agile techniques to develop and think about policy and program delivery. And so that's one category, I'd say. The other, and I think there's been a lot of focus, and we could talk for hours about, my favorite topic of sort of technology integration over time, is just the incredible promise of technologies like artificial intelligence for accomplishing things that were previously either took a really long time for people to do, or could open up new ways for government to do business that it couldn't do before. In fraud reduction, like getting ahead of the fraud through massive pattern recognition analysis of sort of what are the indicators that fraud might occur in the future, and how do you stop that, rather than the traditional kind of wait to see where there's fraud and then chase after that fraud. So I think technology is a powerful enabler of a future government that can deliver in ways that we didn't really think about government doing before.
We have all these regulations that are all these different agencies at different levels of government, and you're supposed to comply with them all. I don't think AI can actually make sense of them because they're internally inconsistent. You just can't do all of this stuff. What I argue, and I have a new book coming out called Saving Can Do, that argues that we really have to transition away from a compliance-based system to a governing structure that provides a framework for human responsibility, including giving the authority to make trade-off choices. So if you want to have a one-stop shop, for example, that they have in other countries like Portugal, you need an official who has the authority to make the trade-off judgments needed to weigh one regulatory good or requirement against another. And because you can't comply with it all without having the paralytic system that we have now. And this idea of moving towards a framework for official responsibility, which, by the way, offends a lot of conservative intellectuals because they've always thought that what you do with government is you limit it by putting handcuffs on officials. And I argued to them and convinced some of them that actually that just handcuffs yourself. You're also handcuffed to the 1,000-page rule book. So if you want to have a government that actually serves the people and attract good people to government, you've got to give them responsibility. And we don't have a system now that does that. No one has the authority to make the trade-off judgment, at least in any honest way, as to whether for example, the benefits of a high-speed transmission line are worth the harms of cutting through a pristine forest. That's not a legal question. That's ultimately a value judgment. It's a political question. It ought to be politically accountable. It ought to be transparent. I'm all for environmental review, but you're never going to resolve it in 10 years of process. It ought to be decided not by some judge after 10 years, but by somebody who's elected. And so we need to, I think, come to grips with the fact that the compliance model of post-1960s government, the 1,000-page rule books, the proceedings that go on forever, the right of anybody to bring a challenge because it affects their interest if they lose a job or don't get a government contract or whatever they're complaining about, has to be replaced by a simpler framework that gives officials the right to make these choices.
I think it's a really interesting point to think about. How would you create a set of incentives for government leaders to act with more agility, to be able to interact with the people that they're serving more easily and rapidly, and to, a lot of the work of not just here, but governments around the world gets done through competitive contracts. How do you then enable the contractors' incentives to align with these types of strategic incentives? Because if you set up the kind of high-level parameters that we're discussing, and you don't actually drive them through to performance mechanisms like contracts and grants, performance evaluation criteria, et cetera, then you'll have strategy, but not a lot of sustained action. And so I think it's really important to think about both setting the vision and also how do you implement that vision.
In addition to having political accountability for choices made, it's easy to put in checks and balances like the framers did. You could have, for example, you could give procurement officials much more authority, and for large contracts, require them to be approved by an independent procurement board of people who are retired procurement officers. So any contract over, pick a number, $200 million, goes to this board, and the person who's negotiated the contract has to make the case about why this is a good idea. That's so much better a system and so much quicker a system than one that goes through all these formal protocols. It's like a elaborate Renaissance dance or something, at the end of which whoever loses brings a grievance. I mean, that's just such a stupid way to govern. Let people use their judgment. If we don't trust them, have it be subject to somebody else's judgment. But if you look at all the things that worked, so some of the New Deal projects, they weren't going through, it was just Harry Hopkins giving money out. And by the way, the audits found that money was really well used. It's very little fraud and all that, but they did audit it. America can do things, but you do have to give people the authority to make choices.
And I think there's an opportunity in the contracting area, especially right now with the revolutionary fire overhaul that the administration is pursuing, working with GSA and OMB and the FAR Council, the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, to try to look at, are there ways we can move down a path toward what Phil's articulating as some of these sort of larger goals. So we'll see how that plays out over time. But one of several pathways to reform, James-Christian, that continue this historical arc that we started by talking about.
I think leading organizations and certainly leading the country comes down to people, money, and things. And in things, I broaden that term to mean services and technology. Dan, you mentioned the promise of artificial intelligence and talking about technology integration. And Philip, you've been talking about human judgment and human responsibility. What are the barriers to getting there for a better government in the future? And how do you balance using artificial intelligence, human responsibility, and human judgment so that you get the accountability that people need?
It took us 250 years to build up the barriers that exist today, so we might not get over them by next month. I will say that in the world of human integration, decision-making, a small piece of research that actually our center has out today from Professor Bill Resch at Georgia State talks about generative AI and its impact on government work and how it can help people to achieve greater productivity and sort of reinvent in ways that are kind of smaller versions of what we're talking about here, kind of think about new ways that they can perform and behave in the workplace using, and he did this through some really deep statistical analysis on some different databases. And I think that we need sort of a field theory that probably can be developed through scholarship. And that James-Christian, I think the Academy can help lead this, is to how do you put together these kinds of technology platform, human incentive, and then organizational pattern to match that? Because right now, not just government, but most organizations kind of exist in a somewhat hierarchical, traditional management structure. Some leading organizations that are newer, some of the new tech companies have kind of started to turn that on its head. But how do you think about this kind of as a public-private partnership, especially at a time when citizen needs and the opportunities from technology and reforms are increasing, but you have a government, budget that in the U.S. and most countries is constrained, if not declining. So how do you create this as a public-private conversation and body of work?
Going further, I'd say that you can't change things overnight, as Dan says. I think one could start with pilot projects in different areas. Procurement would be one, infrastructure approval would be another. You can be lots of different areas where you have, depending on our view of executive authority and statutory authority, but let's say it's statutory, you have a pilot project that's authorized by a order or law that says, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary. There's always a basis for someone who doesn't like a project, a legal basis for them to object. So you need an authorization for pilot projects that basically it makes it not subject to those laws as if it were an emergency, and has a protocol, and then you see how the protocol works. And if the protocol works pretty well, then all the other stuff becomes vestigial, and maybe it's easier to get rid of it. And I think one can do that in a variety of areas. You can do it in infrastructure permitting. You can do it in procurement. You can do it in civil service reform. You think of all the ways, all the things that all of us have been beating our head against the wall on, for decades. Well, now's an opportunity where we could start trying new things, but it's not flipping a switch and making all of government work differently. It's just trying new, simplified approaches.
Dan, you mentioned citizen needs, and our government is under intense pressure to modernize, and there's increasing expectations to deliver better outcomes with fewer resources. And Philip, you mentioned kind of piloting different concepts, but none of that can happen without trust. And there's a real trust deficit right now between the public and our government. How do we close that gap? And how do we rebuild trust so that we can reimagine or create a better government going forward?
I would say that there are many governments. We talk about government and trust often as like binary conditions in a sentence. There's different levels of trust, and there are different levels of trust for many parts of the government, both within the federal government and at state and local. And so, there's often greater trust from people with their local government. So I know that the Academy is, working more frequently with states, and maybe there's some opportunities for some of the pilots to go on at that level. Or maybe there are some, government programs like, how does NASA think about building up trust when there's, millions of people who log in for a space launch? How does Interior, how have they built up trust in their recreation.gov program, which, millions of people use to have really fantastic experiences in national parks? So how do you think about doing these kinds of pilots and learning from where the trust is higher, and then translating those lessons to where data shows the trust is not as high or
Right.
quite low?
The trust is much higher at lower levels of government. People trust local government more. They know the officials. They can talk to them. I think a new narrative that needs to be made is the role of increasing authority is not increasing authority in the White House. It's increasing authority in the community, and it's increasing authority at the district office of the Forest Service. It's increasing authority, at the local national parks and that sort of thing. It's a distributed authority. The whole point is to let people use common sense in context. It's really important to have government present itself to citizens, as real people, not as disembodied systems.
At any level of government, you're going to need great public sector leadership. What do those characteristics and qualities look like today, but also going forward in the future? What do we need and what should we expect from our public servants?
From our leaders or from the staff?
Let's take that question in two parts and let's talk about what should we expect from our leaders, but also what should we expect from our career corps that's carrying out the large majority of the work.
We've done a lot of work on leadership in government over the years, and the ability to do what we're doing today, to kind of try to define a vision for the direction of whatever the program or operation is that the leader is working with, and then to provide a translation algorithm, almost like an inflection point, because most government leaders have another boss above them, whether they're politically appointed or if the career workforce, enabling them to understand how to work as a coalition with their leaders, and then also to provide the space for their teams to operate effectively in a world where change is happening all the time. There's new technologies coming in. There's massively greater transparency in what the government's doing because of all the different social media channels that exist, potentially bringing the news to people all over the world in a split second when something happens. So how do you create the space to promote innovation? And then if you are on a team, how do you characterize that innovation and sort of characterize your performance in ways that demonstrate that the government is about making progress for the people that the government serves? So developing ways to measure, if you're in a program staff working on a small business loan program, how do you show the impact on the communities of business that you're working with? And so leaders can help create the space to enable those very highly skilled officials often working with stakeholders to develop those kinds of metrics, which I think doing that in a way that matches what Phil described as this sort of loose kind of empowerment model. I don't know what other word to use, where the people who are closest to the operation are sort of seeing what's working well and what's not, and can make adjustments, and then have authority structures, or rather incentive structures that enable people to be rewarded for success, but also to be to have their work properly addressed in case there are performance problems. And the government could do more of that all the way along.
I think that attracting good people to government and keeping good people in government requires first giving them authority to use their judgment so that they know that they're making a difference. That's what good teachers feel. Good teachers go to the classroom. They know they're affecting the lives of those students. And that's why they do it, despite all the work and the hardship and everything else of being a teacher nowadays, because they are changing lives. Public officials need to have that same sense of satisfaction and authority. And that requires that the leaders above them, whether appointed or do a good job, because the leadership of an organization is essential to mutual trust, that values and standards are being upheld. That requires being able to make judgments about who's not doing the job and such, again, which we've lost. And I know NAPA's done a lot of really important work and hosted important forums that are ongoing about what an ideal structure of civil service should be. But I think ultimately attracting good people to government is a function of letting them come into organizations where they can make a difference and where the organization itself is run in a way that upholds values and standards and honors the dual loyalties of public officials, which is not simply to do whatever the political leader wants, but also to obey the law and to pursue the goals of the law. And so we are obviously in a situation in this country today where we have the disruption of a system in which there was really no accountability, but we've replaced it with one of of political fealty, not one that's necessarily honoring professionalism. So we've got this. So we need a better vision and a better discussion, I think public discussion, to achieve what I was just talking about. Because I mean, there can be no more important job than being a public official.
Let's close on a forward-looking note, and let's talk about that talent of the future. Dan, what advice would you give the next generation of public servants and innovators?
I'd say that you don't have to work in the government for your entire career to have an impact on the nation, community, or society that you're in. That there are pathways that you can work with government and civil society. You can volunteer in your local community to kind of match where government touches the people most often. And think about developing skills of how does a nation serve its people through budget, through tax incentives, through regulatory structures, and then how can you develop skills across multiple of these kind of channels of influencing how a nation operates, and then practice that in a local way in your job, whether you are with a nonprofit or whether you're in a government agency or whether you are in a business working with governments or achieving something important in terms of something that society has in high demand. So I think it's more important that you think about what are the needs of the people that you're serving and how can you, in your role, contribute to those needs and then work as part of a coalition, because it's very rare that one person is the Einstein of their generation and has the one idea that sort of carries the day. How do you then, one of the greatest skills is how do you work in a coalition across that kind of builds and brings in the best minds, best people to achieve an outcome.
And Philip, there's a lot of opportunity. We've talked about it here. What gives you hope about how our country can serve the people, and what gives you hope for the future of government?
I think the American culture, the kind of roll up your sleeves and let's get it done culture, is one that still exists, and that people have been bottled up by this, I think, flawed operating system that doesn't let people use their judgment. And I think particularly with the advent of AI, there's opportunities for young people to come into government and reimagine how to use these tools, which require adult supervision, but how to use these tools in a way to really deliver and make the country better. There's so many areas of waste and inefficiency in healthcare, schools, et cetera. Well, all these things can get reinvented now. So we're at a moment of disruption in several respects, not only Trump, but also AI and technology, things that Dan's been talking about. Let's take advantage of it.
We've been having a conversation about reimagining government. We have a real opportunity to create a new vision for how a strong representative government can serve the American people. And we've just heard from Dan Chenok and Philip Howard on some ideas on how we can get there in the future. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks much.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.